Chapter 8. Into Maronia. Aramis drove his carriage to the outskirts of Maronia, the main city village of the southern region. As a seaport, Maronia was a busy city for trade and fishing, with much vice in the streets. Many taverns dotted the cobble-strewn streets of the dirty city. Its perimeter was made up of a series of ports and embankments that connected to a large span of water that surrounded the area. The city village was a haven to all types, and Aramis followed the directions given to him by the village elders that would take him to the merchant Jacen, a man known to be fair and helpful to all that would help him profit from a venture. Aramis had driven the wagon all through the night and steered the carriage through the southern city gates of Maronia early the next morning. He was exhausted from his travel through the potential dangers of night travel, but luck had been with him and he pressed on, determined to find his wife at any cost. With Gerard's letter of introduction in hand, Aramis parked his mule-driven coach into a rentable stall and paid the tender what he considered a ridiculous amount in silver for one day's rent. Confident his materials were secured, he set off down the path towards the pawn tents of the merchant Jacen. As soon as her father walked away, Hope let herself out from her hiding spot in the tarp-covered wagon and with giddy glee set off to see the sights of this glorious city that was just waking up in the morning dawn. Aramis found Jacen's tents and walked through the curtains and hanging beads into its dark interior. A strange reed harp music constantly played in the background, and the interior was slightly smoking from the drifty incense that burned at small tables. Inside there were several large men wearing a light armor and carrying spears and daggers that stood at various regions within the large series of tents that was Jacen's hut. A giant warehouse made of interlocking tents, rooms, and huts would have been a more apt description. Aramis tiredly walked up to one of the guards and presented his letter of introduction from the village elders. "I need to speak with the merchant Jacen on an urgent matter. Please give him this letter at once, sir." The guard took the letter, looked at it, then nodded and walked away into the further interior of the hut. Aramis sat down with a sigh on a nearby bench and looked around. Peering around the stuffy tent, Aramis noticed with disgust a woman filleting a man in a nearby adjoining room. The man was moaning loudly with his head drawn back and his eyes closed. Two of the nearby guards pointed at Aramis and laughed at his discomfiture. A moment later, a tall, overweight man known as the merchant Jacen walked towards him with his letter in hand. The man wore a large and flowing robe made of a shimmering material and wore several rings of gold upon his fingers. He had a full beard and a head of hair that was mostly black and peppered with gray here and there. Striding up to the farmer, the heavy-set man spoke. "Aramis?" he asked in a deep baritone. The farmer stood up and nodded. The man said, "I am Jacen. Come with me so I can hear your tale directly," and beckoned Aramis to follow him through a series of tent flaps into a private office. The office held silk-covered couches amidst a giant granite desk behind which the man known as Jacen now sat behind. As Aramis sat upon one of the couches, the merchant said, "I am very sorry to hear about your father. He was a good man, and I was always impressed by his lectures when he would visit our great village. Please, tell me how I can be of assistance to you." Aramis lowered himself onto one of the couches and poured out his story. At the end, Jacen nodded and spoke, "And so you need my help to find your wife. Yes, yes. I believe I can help you, although you will be subject to my usual service fee. To equip you with suitable guides, I will charge you 100 silvers and will be due 20% of any gains you make along the journey." Aramis sat stunned, not believing what he was hearing. He only had 40 silvers on him, which represented his family's entire savings after the last 10 harvests. After a moment, he agreed to pay Jacen the 40 silvers and explained he would have to owe him the rest. Jacen sat quietly thinking it over, then nodded. As Aramis poured his silver coin onto the granite desk, Jacen counted out the silvers and put the coin into a leather purse, as he told Aramis he would arrange for the guides and guards to meet him that evening to leave the city in search for the wife. As the merchant stood up to leave and make the arrangements, he invited Aramis to rest in the hut. He led Aramis to a semi-private tent that held a cot with a folded comforter and a small end table that displayed fresh pieces of fruit. As Jacen strode away, Aramis picked up a purple-colored apple and lay down on the cot. His eyes soon shut, and the apple rolled out of his hand as he fell into a fitful rest, filled with dreams of never finding his wife again. Jacen left the sleeping Aramis and headed out to his chief concierge. His man Rohan was busy as usual, tending to the guests of the hut when he noticed his master's eye looking in his direction. Rohan turned and nodded once, giving the signal that he would meet the master in their private office immediately. Moments later, they each arrived at the private tent that was their meeting place and sat across from each other at the small circular table that parted them. Vishan poured each of them a small cup of bitter tea, which each man gathered and drank. Eventually, Vishan spoke. "Rohan, I need you to find an available bounty hunter that has tracking skills and a spare man. Do you know of any that are currently in the city?" he asked. Rohan thought for a moment, then replied, "I believe Euclidean and his servant are currently in the city for one of their bouts." Vishan replied, "Excellent. Find him at once and ask him to attend me here for a bounty job." Rohan nodded once, rose, and left the tent to complete his master's orders. A crowd of sweaty men and women brayed out their desire to see the fight in Maronia's small gladiatorial fighting pit. Money exchanged hand as bets were placed on the two fighters that faced each other before the crowd. The powerful fighter, known as Euclidean, lightly danced side to side as he considered the native that stood across the sandpit from him. The native was over 6 feet tall and all muscle, gleaming and taut. His broad muscular frame was reddish-colored, and his face was a blend of crisscrossing scars that marked him as having seen tribal combat. The champion, Euclidean, was also tall and very muscular, his body honed from many years of training in sandpit fighting. The champion was ebony-skinned, with his head and body free of hair, revealing his own share of scars from battle. As the tribal screamer began his lament notifying the crowd of the coming mid-morning fight, Euclidean quietly moved through his routine of neck muscle loosening activities and began a concentrated breathing pattern. The crowd was braying for blood, a constant overshadowing of sound around the lament of the screamer. The Fightmaster finished his ceremonial words of combat, looked at the two fighters, and struck his gong to indicate the fight started. The native roared and rushed at Euclidean, who rolled to the left of the giant at the last minute, bringing a sway of appreciative sound from the baying crowd. The giant moved in and savagely struck his arms downward, glancing off Euclidean's shoulders, causing him to momentarily stagger. Suddenly, Euclidean brought both his arms up in an arcing pattern, and the outer ridge of his left hand cleanly struck the giant's cheekbone, forcing his head to snap backwards. The giant was momentarily dazed, allowing Euclidean to launch into his signature move, an upward leap that would bring him into range of executing a foot strike into the opponent's outer thigh. Euclidean's manservant Chino watched the fight from the corner of the sandpit, completely at ease that his master would survive the bout. His master was the current fist champion of Greenwaldia, a title he had held unopposed for the last 10 seasons. Chino saw that the giant was tiring quickly, and that his master would soon finish the bout, most likely with a flourish to please the crowd. Just then, Rohan arrived and spotted him standing on the edge of the fighting pit amongst the screaming men and women. Walking over, Rohan whispered into Chino's ear, "Vishan has a job he would like to offer Euclidean. Please come see him after the fight is complete." Chino acknowledged Rohan and returned his attention to the fight. The flourish came all too suddenly, and the brute was caught off guard, allowing Euclidean to leap up and grab the beast's neck between the massive bicep muscle and forearm of one arm in a headlock. Within moments, the beast fell to the ground with his face a purple blotch of color as his windpipe was slowly crushed by Euclidean's efforts. At the last moment, Euclidean released his hold, causing the giant to gasp for breath in a kneeling position. As the giant regained his breath, he slowly held up his palm, giving the sign for surrender. The crowd began baying Euclidean's name as he helped the giant stand up and embraced him. He held up his hands to the crowd and walked towards Chino, who held a towel outstretched and began wiping his master down. The tribal screamer finished his money exchanging from the bets that had taken place and brought over a large sack containing silver epaulets and coins as two new fighters took position in the sandpit. The unending sound of the screaming men and women continued around the men. He handed the bag to Chino and said to Euclidean, "Good fight, eh, Euclidia? You always please crowd," and walked away laughing to himself to start up his lamentations for the next bout. More fighters were making their way to the sandpit as the tribal screamer walked away, and Chino spoke to Euclidean. "Excellent work as usual, master," he said. Yes, he was strong, but ran out of breath all too soon," Euclidean responded. As they left the sandpit to the private training tents nearby, the manservant conveyed the invitation from Vishan. Euclidean received a post-fight massage, then cleaned himself in a bathing pool and changed into a relaxed tunic and sandals. Euclidean and his manservant Chino left the training tents and screaming crowds behind as they entered an awaiting coach that would carry them to Vishan's hut. The large pouch of winnings made a jingling sound as Chino carried the bag for his master. As the coach drove away, the hidden assassin's eyes watched its direction and thought of the size of the money pouch Euclidean had won. Upon their arrival, Vishan greeted Euclidean and Chino and led them to sit on the couches across from his granite desk. He joined them on an adjacent chair and explained the story of Aramis and the need to travel into the great forest in search of a kidnapped wife who was likely already spoiled and or killed. Vishan explained that Aramis had agreed to pay him 100 silvers to cover the expenses of the search and the hiring of 3 guards. He brought out the 40 silvers Aramis had given him, placed the coin in a small leather bag, and handed the silver to Chino, who put the money away. "You'll get the other half at the completion of the mission. My usual finder's fee of 20% of any profits made on the trip will apply, of course." Euclidean accepted the bounty, rose and shook hands with Vishan, and agreed to meet Aramis later that evening to begin the search of the forest and the lost wife within. Leaving Vishan, he and Chino rode their carriage back to Euclidean's private estate on the outskirts of the city. They arrived and entered through a gate that was guarded by 2 men in armor carrying spears. As Euclidean and Chino entered the broad estate, 2 other servants brought refreshments to the 2 men and quickly responded to prepare the items that Euclidean listed off would be needed for the journey. Euclidean and Chino moved off to their separate quarters and individually began to prepare the provisions they would need for the travel ahead. As he gathered his provisions, Chino's mind wandered back to the strange way he had first met his master, Euclidean. When he was 18 years old, his parents' farm had been hit by the plague, and all the cattle and crops had died. His mother and 2 younger sisters had died of hunger, and his father, lost in despair, had drowned his sorrows in alcohol until one day he too passed on. Left alone and starving at age 18, Chino had wandered away from the plague-ridden farm, himself free of the disease, and had followed the main road for several days until passing out from exhaustion. He awoke to find himself lying on the most comfortable bed he had ever lay upon. He had been bathed and he was wearing fresh clothing, and he no longer felt the gnawing hunger that had been his constant companion for so long. An old woman was sitting in a chair next to him and rose to exit the room when she had noticed he was awake. Soon after, the master had entered the room, and the 18-year-old recognized him as Euclidean, the pit fighter champion and wealthy landowner in the region. He pushed himself up onto the pillows of the bed to try to greet the great man. Euclidean spoke, "Easy lad, you're in my care now, and once you're up and running, we'll figure it out what next." With that, he patted Chino on the arm and left the room, and did not see the boy again for many nights. 2 weeks later, the renewed 18-year-old lad was helping to chop wood for the estate when he next saw the master. Euclidean had said to him, "Well, you look fit as a king, and I imagine you'll want to be pushing on to wherever you're headed." The 18-year-old began to quietly sob as he realized yet again the loss of his family and farm. Chino explained his plight to Euclidean, who listened quietly. When he had finished the short tale, Euclidean paused, then asked the boy, "I'm in need of a new manservant. Is that something you would be interested in doing for me?" As the youth was about to eagerly accept the offer, Euclidean held up a hand and spoke again and said, "Do not make a hasty response until you know what you would be agreeing to." He looked away, then said, "Although I am a prize fighter, I am also a bounty hunter on occasion, and would require you attend me in all my endeavors. This would likely take you into dangerous circumstances, and I will need your word that you will do exactly as I say in all things for the duration of your service, even to kill another man." The youth had not enjoyed the idea of killing someone, but agreed to a 10-season service agreement and had begun training with the master every day. From his sparring and wrestling practice with his new master, he soon became a formidable hand-to-hand opponent himself and slowly learned about the inside world of bounty hunting, as well as the secret darker side of his master, the great Euclidean. Over the years that followed, he had assisted the master on numerous occasions when performing a bounty hunt, or with seeking after information, and the two were soon collaborating on the planning of their bounty hunting missions. Chino realized the 10 seasons had almost ended, and he was brought out of his daydreaming as he loaded their supplies upon one pack mule, double-checked the hunting bows that were attached to the saddles, and made sure their double short swords were sufficiently oiled and ready in their harnesses. Donning his own hunting armor and helping the master don his hunting armor, they each stepped into the leather saddles of their horses, gathered the line to the mule, and set off back to Vishan's to meet the man who was looking for his kidnapped wife. As they rode, Chino shuddered as he thought of his private secret that endangered his master. The assassin's eyes watched the men leave the estate on their horses and set after them in his usual pursuit of the great prey, Euclidean. Jacen, Janae, and Benny walked through the south entrance of Maronia at midday and began looking for affordable taverns. Dragging their meager barrow of supplies over to a nearby tavern, Janae paid the tavern keeper a small fee to store the wagon and supplies while they sat down for a midday meal in the open patio used to serve customers. Janae was just completing arrangements with the tavern owner to sell her 2 goats when a small crowd within the tavern called out their excited greetings after a tall man in reddish-colored hunting clothes. The tall man was passing by outside with a younger man in similar hunting clothes following closely. The tall man waved at the crowd and momentarily glanced over at Jacen as he and the younger man passed. Benny asked loudly, "Who's that tall man, Auntie?" Janae gathered several silver coins from the sale of the goats into a pouch and answered, "I don't know, Benny, but he seems very popular." As they finished their meal, the trio stepped out to the mid-afternoon air and began to walk towards the Crofters' Market near the tavern. A group of 3 men were leaning on the wall of the tavern, and one of them called out to Janae as the trio passed. "Where you going, my beautiful?" inquired one of the men, who wore travel-stained clothing and had dirt on his face. The other 2 similarly clad men grinned at each other in a mischievous way at their friend's inquiry. Janae looked at the men, then turned away and asked Jacen if he knew where they might look for work. Angered at being ignored, the dirty man left the wall he was leaning on and spoke roughly to Janae as he aggressively walked toward her. "Hey, Clutch, I'm talking to you," he said aggressively. His 2 companions trailed closely behind him. Several people paused in their walk to stare at the building confrontation, but did nothing to help the group, as travelers were often accosted in the great city. Just as the dirty man reached Janae and lifted a hand to grab her shoulder, Janae suddenly produced a wickedly sharp skinning knife from her scabbard and held it to the man's throat, causing him to freeze in his tracks. "I don't think you want to bother us," hissed Janae to the man and pushed the knuckles of her knife hand roughly into the man's neck, causing him to stagger backwards. The dirty man brought his hand to his neck and stared furiously at Janae in great anger. Just then, he and his companions drew daggers from hidden sheaths and held them in front of them, and walked warily towards Janae, Jacen, and Benny. "Now you're gonna get it, Clutch," said the dirty leader. Jacen reached up for his staff when Benny suddenly screamed and picked up a handful of packhorse manure piled nearby on the ground and flung it at the main leader. The manure struck the man in the face, causing a wet slapping noise to echo in the street, and the manure slid off the man's face to splash in a messy pile by his feet. After a moment of silence, his 2 companions began roaring with laughter at the sight of their friend, each bent over with mirth. Benny started laughing in a loud, braying manner while pointing at the man, when suddenly the man let out a scream of rage and ran at Benny. Just as he was about to reach Benny, a vibrating sound was momentarily heard flying through the air as the blunt side of Jacen's staff struck the attacker on the side of the head with a loud electrical cracking noise, causing the dirty man to stumble and fall face first into the pile of manure Benny had used earlier. The strange metallic weapon bounced back in the direction it had come from, where Jacen deftly caught it out of the air. The man did not rise, and Janae took that moment to quickly pull out her bow, notch an arrow, and aim it at the men's companions. With Janae aiming the wickedly sharp hunting arrow at the men, Jacen said, "Why don't you fellows collect your friend and shove off before Benny covers you in manure?" Benny brayed out laughter again when Jacen said this, causing the nearby onlookers to laugh as well. The 2 men slowly put away their knives and cautiously picked up their unconscious friend, causing the onlookers to push on and leave the trio alone. As the final onlookers moved on, Jacen turned to Janae and asked her, "Are you okay?" Janae put away the arrow she had been aiming at the men. After a pause, she smiled and said, "Yes, unfortunately I've had to deal with that kind of treatment before." She put away her bow, then walked over to Benny and gave him a big hug. "Thank you for protecting me, Benny," she said, causing the short boy to grin. Soon after the exchange, the group pressed on towards the Crofters' Market to look for work. Euclidean and Chino watched the entire exchange from a nearby hidden alcove. The large fighter clicked his tongue approvingly when Janae responded with cool effort, then chuckled when Benny threw the manure onto the leader. When Jacen had thrown the staff with such accuracy, he turned to Chino and nodded. "See if they will join us, as they appear to need work," he said. Chino asked, "Just out of curiosity, how did you know they would beat the men when you hired the thugs to start the fight?" Euclidean paused and watched the trio walking away, then said, Just a hunch. He left then, heading on to Vishan's tents. Chino watched his master leave, remarking to himself how lucky the man was. He always had a hunch for things that seemed to work out exactly as he thought they would. Following his master's orders, Chino left to track down the trio and offer them work. Jacen, Janae, and Benny were looking at the various job postings at the Crofters Market when Chino walked up to them. "Pardon me, fine travelers. I'm Chino, manservant to the great Euclidean. We are in need of experienced travelers such as yourself to aid us on an errand of mercy." Jacen and Janae looked at each other briefly, then back at the manservant who wore hunting armor. Chino continued, "Would you be available for 1 week's worth of work to start tonight?" he asked the group. "What will the work entail?" asked Jacen. "You would accompany us as we search the nearby great forest for the kidnapped wife of the man who hired us. You will receive an equal share of any spoils earned along the way, minus a 20% fee to our contact, the merchant Vishan, here in Maronia." Chino paused to let the offer settle, then continued. "The travel will likely be dangerous, and we may find the need to fight our way through any brigands we encounter," he explained. "In other words, you need extra eyes to secure the camp," said Janae. "Let us talk amongst ourselves for a moment. Where can we find you?" "We will leave from Vishan's hut in 1 hour. If you agree to join us, look for us there," spoke Chino, and he gracefully bowed as he moved away. As the man walked away, Jacen said, "We're getting lucky, not in town for even 1 day, and we've already found a week's paid work." "I'm not sure I want to take Benny into dangerous regions of the forest," said Janae. Jacen paused, then said, "Well, he would be with us the whole time, and it might be good for Benny to learn how to travel the forest." Janae looked at the short youth and asked, "What do you think, Benny?" "I trust you, Auntie," Benny said, then wandered to a nearby stall to look at the wares. Jacen looked at Janae and said, "We would likely be back in a week, and it sounds like a good chance to make contacts in the area for future work. Plus, we would get a chance to get to know one another, and I would really like that." After a moment, Janae smiled and nodded in agreement. Gathering Benny and asking directions to Vishan's hunt, the trio headed off to meet with Chino. As they walked, Jacen placed himself protectively near Janae, and his personal quest to find his master was put on hold for the time being. He unconsciously scratched at the diamond shape under his eye, which continued its subtle yet constant burning sensation.